Hi there, and welcome back to the Fuse Show. Today I'm joined by Siam Choudhury. Siam Choudhury is a product manager turned founder with a background at Facebook and Swedish startups Acast and funded by me. He started Pliance together with two other co-founders in 2018 to build anti-money laundering automation. Thanks for joining us in the show.
Thanks, David. Happy to be here.
So you mentioned that you're a person who started in the world of product and turned founder. I actually feel like that's a pretty natural transition. Was that something you always intended or something that just happened organically over time?
I think I've always thought about starting something, and I think I got a lot of interest in working close to product and with product while I was at Facebook, and but I didn't never knew sort of what I would do, and sort of being close to product and sort of really getting into it, that sort of started sparking like more and more ideas, and then finally in 2018 or late 2017, I started getting the like, okay, now it's time to really do something. I think it helped, and I wanted to do something, but never found that I had the right timing or the right co-founders.
AML is a relatively like niche category. AML is anti-money laundering. Like, how did you stumble upon this domain?
Yeah, so like the first experience I had of it was as a product manager for Funded by Me, which is a sort of crowdfunding solution. And I was a product manager, and I had my roadmap of cool features and everything that I wanted. And our compliance person would be like, "Hey, we also have to think about these, and these things." So my first sort of exposure to AML and compliance was a sort of a negative one, because it was like sort of messing with my ability to build whatever I wanted to build. And then my co-founders, they've also worked with AML tools and from sort of they've experience as developers from banking and sort of finance. And they came across it from the other side of like, oh, hey, we've built these tools before and they're not really expanding a lot. Like they're not innovating in this field as much as finance and banking and sort of fintech is. And we think we could do something here. And so from that, we kind of started discussing like, okay, well, let's talk to customers. Let's see if our idea that, you know, poor or sort of inefficient AML processes and tools are holding back sort of some of these fintech companies. And it turned out that, yeah, a lot of those were like they had to basically rebuild tools that other banks already had in order to sort of at the same time compete with these sort of established companies. So we're like, okay, well, there's something here for us to do, like offer modern companies better, more modern tools to build these things on.
Taking a step back, can you? I probably should have done this first. Could you give a background on what AML is, or what is money laundering in general for people who may not be aware?
Yeah, I mean, the short description is that it's trying to hide the origin of criminally acquired funding to be able to integrate that into society as sort of clean money that you can use for, investments or purchasing sort of, real estate or sort of art or anything. So essentially, it's about being able to live off your criminally acquired sort of cash or money.
So, for an example, it might be I don't know, a drug dealer like sells drugs, makes money, but they want to make clean money, so they open up another business and pretend the money came through the other business. Is that an example?
Pretty much, yeah.
Okay.
I mean, it's there's always a sort of a pre-crime in money laundering because for some reason you want to hide where the money actually came from, but you also want to be able to sort of, well, you as in criminals, criminals will want to sort of live on their sort of proceeds, but they can't necessarily sort of buy an apartment with just sort of duffel bags of cash. So they have to be able to show that, okay, well, this money came from this business that I have, or oh, these are all sort of casino winnings, and those kind of things. So there are a lot of different ways of trying to do that, and there's also a lot of different ways of catching those kind of sort of activities.
So, how'd you go from hearing about, oh, this is a requirement my business needs to comply with, to, hey, I want to be the one to build this?
We actually started off by thinking it would be like a really simple thing to get started in. We didn't have this sort of big vision when we first started. We're like, okay, well, one part of sort of AML compliance, so following the law of what you have to do, is that you need to check your customers for whether or not they're sanctioned by EU or the US or anything like that. Or you have to see if they have what's called a politically exposed person status, which means that they're a political person, have some sort of position which could be abused in terms of money laundering or corruption. And we're like, well, okay, so there's lists of those kind of people, companies generate them and they sell them to banks, and then those banks build those systems themselves. Well, maybe we could do just an API solution for that. And once we started talking to customers, we realized that that is something that more modern sort of companies wanted. They wanted to have sort of microservices, API services that they could build into their solutions, rather than having either old school web-based solutions or really sort of poor API solutions like SOAP-based or anything like that. So that kind of, it's because it started off as it's a really small thing. It seemed like, oh yeah, we could do this, and let's just go ahead. And then it's only later that we kind of saw the complexity of like, hey, there's a lot more to do here than just sort of tying a database into an API and offering that to customers. And then that's when we really start to figure out, okay, what do we want to do? And what is the sort of the bigger picture than just providing this microservice?
You mentioned talking to multiple potential customers before building. Is that right?
Yeah.
Do you have a ballpark of how many conversations you had and what you learned from those?
Yeah, I think we had about half a dozen at a very early stage, and then maybe 6 or 10 more, like as we were sort of figuring out, like, okay, this is the type of customer that seems to sort of our conversations are sort of gearing more towards. And very early, it was a very broad type of customer. It was pretty much, or persons. It was anybody working within legal or compliance, and really for us to try and understand, like, well, why do they have to do this? How are they doing it? What kind of tools are they using? And then later it became much more about, well, how would they want to do it? Like, and try to sort of compare that to what kind of solution do we want to build? We knew that we were kind of wanted to go initially toward like for developers, tools for developers. We wanted to be API based. That also meant that we started looking at, okay, what kind of companies does this make more sense towards? We talked like very early, we talked to a lot of law firms, but we realized that, okay, well, they're not the ones that are going to develop and build APIs. So we have to start looking at sort of more fintech, more sort of up and coming startups, but also sort of more established financial companies that are becoming more tech savvy. So like, okay, well, how do we make sure that they have the tools that they need?
Did you have personal connections to these people to interview, or did you like find them randomly through like friend of friend of friends?
It was more through sort of not friend of friends, but through networking.
Okay.
So early on, we were sort of invited to join a sort of an accelerator program held by a law firm, which is how we got the first sort of conversations with sort of lawyers within compliance. And sort of they helped us get in touch with real people, and then sort of we kind of followed that thread, like, okay, we talked to one person, like, and then ended with, who else should we talk to? And they would sort of make a connection to somebody else, and then we sort of went that way.
I feel like that's probably one of the definitely underrated strategies for building a network, just always asking people after like a good interaction,
yeah,
hey, who else should I get to know in your network? And I think almost always you'll find someone.
I mean, that's something that we really felt that it helped us really to, how do you say it, like not get stuck in the process. I'm like, okay, we'll talk to this person. Who do we talk to next? And it became like a really natural question for us to ask.
How many people did you have on the team at that point? Was it just you and your two co-founders?
Yeah, it was just me and my two co-founders, and we stayed that way until basically end of 2020, so end of last year.
And how did you meet your co-founders?
So my two co-founders are Adam and Thomas. Adam and I actually know each other from when we were 8 years old. We've gone to the same primary school, same high school, and we've kind of always talked about like, okay, at some point we should do something together. We'd had the same sort of nerdy sort of hobbies, played like text-based RPGs in high school and stuff like that, where we're the only ones doing it. And we kind of had like a good connection. And it took a while, basically 20 years, before we started thinking about like, okay, we're kind of getting to that point where we know enough about ourselves and what we want to do to start thinking about it. And then Adam and Thomas, they've worked together as sort of consultants and sort of developers for the past 10, 12 years. So that's kind of how we got in touch with each other.
So was the idea originally in your mind based off your experiences, and you shared it with those two others to get them to join on board relatively early? Is that how it played out?
No, it was actually like we kind of started from the other end of like me and Adam talking and saying, okay, we want to work together. We want to do something together. Let's start looking at what we can do. So we actually spent a lot of time discussing why we wanted to start a company together. like what that meant to us, what kind of life we wanted to have with this company. And then we started, once we kind of agreed on, okay, we have the same vision here about why we want to start a company. Then we started to kind of, a little bit like product managery wise, like start looking at, okay, what do we have? What kind of common interests do we have in technology and areas? And start to sort of break those down into potential business ideas. So we had like, okay, I worked at Facebook. So we kind of looked at sort of marketing tools or sort of in that space and sort of, again, interviewed customers and then figured out that, okay, well, this area isn't the one where we think that we can sort of make a real difference and really sort of push the innovation. Okay, let's look at the next thing. And then that's kind of like we started looking at our experiences of Adam and sort of Thomas coming from having worked on AML tools at competitors and feeling that there's a lot more to do there. And then me coming from like, okay, well, I've experienced that from as a product manager within this field, there is something there. And then we started to sort of evolve and sort of dig into that and realize that, okay, yeah, here is something where we think we can create something on the short term, but we also think that we see where the industry is going, which means that we can not just be reactive and just build what people tell us to build, but also look at, okay, how can we make sure that we meet customers' need even before they know that they have them?
So automation of AML is what you ended up doing, but how many ideas did you have prior to that you considered, but then talked to people and realized it's probably not worth building?
I think there was a couple. We kind of went pretty deep on a few once we kind of knew the different areas we wanted to work in. I think in terms of analytics for marketing was one, and we kind of focus a lot on influencer marketing. And that's it's a funny story because we kind of dug into it because we saw that, okay, all other types of digital marketing is really going towards data, sort of ROI analysis, very sort of data focused. But influencer marketing wasn't catching up on that. So we kind of think that, okay, well, there is something there. It's going to go that level or go that way. But after talking to all of these different parties like influencers, marketers, agencies, sort of advertisers, we realized that they didn't all see it the same way. So some parties wanted more data focus, others wanted less, some wanted more ROI focus, other wanted or had different variations and definitions of ROI. And we realized that, okay, we could build something here, but we didn't think that we were the person who could bring all of those sort of parties together to decide, okay, what is the way forward? So we're like, okay, well, it's a really cool space and then there's stuff going to happen there, but we're not going to be the ones that can really push that. Like we couldn't see how we would do that. So we're like, all right, well, we'll back away from this one and go on to the next one. And I think it's kind of what stuff that we're seeing now. Like there's a lot of focus on ROI in the influencer marketing space, but I think we made the right decision because we couldn't have pushed it that way.
So going back in terms of timeline, from the time you had an idea of like, hey, the industry is pretty lacking in the AML space to building an MVP, how long was that time delta?
I think from a technical perspective, it was very short. Like we had this proof of concept, we kind of had that in place within sort of 6 to 8 months. But then it was a struggle for us to really sort of get close, like, well, how do we actually sort of reach out to customers and sort of sell this? And how do we actually sort of do that? And particularly for us as 3 non-traditional salespeople who haven't had experience doing that, there was a lot of things that took a lot of time for us. And I think so let's say we started, I think in June 2018, sort of formally like, okay, we set up the company, actually started working forward. We had sort of our sort of databases, our collaborators. We had a proof of concept. We knew that, once we have a company in, we could make it work. Then it took actually us until the following year when we joined an accelerator. And through that alumni network actually got our first couple of customers into the actual platform, where we actually could sort of see the whole process of like, okay, we have a customer in, they're using the tool and they're paying for it. All right, this thing works now.
And when you first started, did you have a good idea on how to price, or did you just price arbitrarily?
We kind of went with looked at what competitors were pricing, and we didn't want it to become a sort of race for the bottom. So we kind of placed ourselves around the level and decided that, hey, we think we are better than our competitors, So why should we be cheaper?
Hmm.
And sort of start going from that perspective. And then it's been sort of an iterative process of like learning from sort of our customers and really understanding that going away from, oh, what competitors are charging to what is the value that we're creating. So that was like a journey for us as well to figure out and learn like how do we do pricing. And that's the journey that we're still on. So it's not finished yet.
So one of the things about API based, or I guess particularly fraud based businesses, is the convincing someone of the value. Because I think a lot of times if someone has zero money laundering on their platform or zero known money laundering on their platform, it's really hard of a sell. Like how do you go about like pitching it?
Yeah, I mean, our initial sort of product has been very much focused on compliance. So like, okay, just, make sure how you have to do this because you are regulated by a financial authority. It's not a nice to have, it's a must have for you. You might lose your license otherwise. And the way that companies are doing it is generally very manual, sort of ineffective, sort of time consuming. So, and all of these things can be made sort of automatic, consistent, scalable, and we kind of pitch it that way. So instead of looking at compliance as a cost center, like look at it as something that you can change to be able to scale your business faster. Because if you're doing it manually, well, maybe you can only onboard, 5 to 10 customers per week or per day. But if you're automating it, then you can go to hundreds, thousands, and that doesn't become a blocker for you anymore. So we were pretty early on looking at it like, hey, let's change how people look at compliance from a cost center to an enabler for their growth. And I think we focus a lot on like ROI in terms of, people spending time. Like this work is being done, and either, your compliance person or sort of even, operations persons are spending a lot of their time checking if a customer is sanctioned, for example, and following up with false positives, or they could be doing something else that probably creates a lot more value within your company than checking against lists.
So diving into, I guess, some slightly more technical details. Let's say someone like hits your API and they have like a list of names, and one of them is a like politically exposed person or a person of
exactly.
Person of interest in your domain. What exactly does your system do to like surface it to your clients?
Yeah. So we have a few different ways of our customers getting that information back, either straight through the API call or on the customers that we have on monitoring. They get it through a webhook or a feed. And basically from there, the customer then can take a look at it, information saying, okay, well, our customer is sort of David. And then we got a match saying that this David is a politically exposed person or sanctioned. But we also then provide a lot of sort of contextual data. Like, okay, well, David is a politically exposed person because he has this role within a political party or sort of a governmental role. And then they can sort of much easier and quicker without leaving their tool, see that, okay, well, actually, this is not our David Tran. This is somebody else. Okay, false positive, move on. Or, okay, actually, this is a match. And then, adjust your risk profile within their service and then sort of move on again. So that they don't have to either ask you for your status where you might not even know, which is very common, that people don't know that they're politically exposed, or they count as politically exposed because their family member or relative is one.
So how, if a person themselves don't know if they're politically exposed, who's tracking all this?
So there are a lot of sort of database or research companies that basically look at the legal definitions, saying like, okay, well, in Sweden, where we're based, for example, these are the categories of people who are counted as politically exposed. For example, certain level of judges.
I see.
So they'll look at like, okay, well, in Sweden, who are the judges of this level? And then they look at like, okay, well, their spouses and their children and their parents also counts. Okay, well, of this judge, who's their spouse, who's their children, and who are their parents? And then sort of start looking at, okay, well, they started being a judge at this date, maybe they stopped being or retired at this date, and sort of do all that information and sort of data collecting. So they focus a lot on doing that and updating, and then that's kind of their focus.
What about the scenarios of money laundering that aren't connected to politically exposed people? Like, what if I'm just an average person that has a insignificant title as defined by whatever these research companies say? Like, let's say I just own a laundromat and I was like selling drugs at the same time. Like, is that something are you trying to build that as a solution into your platform, or is that something else entirely?
That's something that's entirely, but it is something that's on the roadmap for us in
I see.
terms of sort of covering the whole AML process. So the first part that we look at is that, these companies need to become a lot more efficient, sort of digitalized, and sort of automated in their processes, so that if they're, for example, if they're handling a lot of cash into their system, they can be done effectively with the, sort of the compliance part, and then start looking at their own business saying, okay, financial criminals are relatively smart people. If they were to sort of try and abuse my new fintech solution, how would they do that? And how do I then set up the rules and sort of routines to be able to catch or sort of prevent that? Because what we noticed is that a lot of disproportionate amount of time was spent on this, like our checking our customers for PEP or politically exposed persons, checking them against sanctions lists. And that took up too much time, and I didn't have time to really look into like, all right, how do we actually become proactive?
I see. So between you and your two co-founders, how do you decide like what to build in the early days, and how do you decide the split of responsibilities?
Yeah, I mean, because we're only three people, we kind of just went with like, okay, well, CM has experience with account management and sort of marketing and a little bit more on product side. He gets to be the CEO because that means he gets to do everything. And then Adam and Thomas, because they're developers, they're like, okay, well, they'll be co-CTOs. They're both back-end focused, and at that early stage, that's it doesn't really matter who does what, again, from that perspective. And then in terms of how we decided on what to build, we kind of became very pragmatic. Thought that, okay, we really need to show that this use case that we're thinking about actually works, and that itself has value before we start adding a lot of features. So we kind of decided very early to keep the product very niche and very small. Like, yes, you send in customer data, we send you information back. And there is value in that, because that's what kind of the manual process looks like. And if we can automate it and scale it, there should be plenty of value in just doing that. So very early stage, we kind of decided that that's what we're going to focus on. And we even sort of took a decision that once we knew that that was working, that we, instead of adding new features, we were like, okay, well, that works. Let's now learn how to sell this, because we need to be much better at understanding our customers and understanding who this has value for, rather than building something as soon as another customer says, oh, if you only had this thing, then we would buy it. We'd be like, okay, well, then at the moment, you're not our customer. You have to find the ones that find the value in just the sort of tiny thing that we've created.
Earlier, you mentioned how you're relatively new to sales and you've been learning a lot through the journey. Is that right?
Yeah.
So how'd you make that initial like jump in terms of like friction of like, I've never sold something, to like, I am now responsible for selling all of my company's product? Like, that's a major responsibility gap. Like, how'd you go about like breaking that down?
I mean, it was a lot of sort of try and do online learning. Like, okay, how do you sell? And going a lot from like what we think is selling. So it was like, okay, we set up a sort of CRM system, and they have this little pipeline of activities. And, oh, a customer asked about pricing. So I guess they're in sort of proposal mode, which they weren't, because that's generally not how it works. But that was like a learning for us, that, okay, we're doing something, we have activities. And that was a sort of an early realization for us once we kind of had 3 customers that we kind of stumbled upon, because they were alumni of the accelerator that we were in, and we have one sort of completely cold customer. We realized that, okay, so this flow works. Sort of a customer will find value, they can implement our service, and they will pay for it. We just have to figure this out before we do anything else. So we actually went back to one of our sort of accelerator coaches who works on like helping sort of startups really set up the sales strategies, and started working with them in the beginning of 2020, pretty much on January 2nd. Like, okay, we need help. And that process really helped us to set a sales strategy that worked for us at an early stage, really segment our customers, do role playing and practicing on cold calls. And that's something that we all 3 of us did. So even sort of Adam and Thomas were sort of really back end developers who were like, okay, yeah, I guess they knew that, if we wanted this to work, they also had to sort of pick up the phone and make calls. And we're kind of early days, like sitting in a small room, like kind of like this, like, all right, Adam's going to do a call. All right, let's pump him up. Let's do this. And then sort of learning from that. And obviously then we kind of realized, okay, well, there are certain strengths and that people can focus on other things. But it was a really good exercise to do together to really understand that, okay, this is something that we have to solve one way or another. It can't be solved by, oh, we'll just hire somebody to do the sales for us. And also, even if we do hire somebody, we have to be able to tell them how selling works for our product, the way that we talk about it. And there is also a huge, what we learned is a huge benefit of being founders who are selling, because we know the product so well that we can communicate that in a very different way than somebody who comes in, because it's going to take them as long as it took for us to sort of get into the product. And we had been doing it for 3 years. So it's kind of, it's unfair to expect that a salesperson comes in and within 2 months is supposed to be as knowledgeable as you to be able to communicate your product to somebody else.
Was that, how many cold calls did you do, and how many did you have to do before the nerves start to die down?
I kind of still feel that I get the nerves when I'm doing cold calls. I think initially, like before we started working with this advisor and setting up the sales strategy, we were doing emails only. And even afterwards, we had our sort of sales process, and email was the first sort of step. And then we kind of waited with having to do that first phone call. And it was still, I think, very early days, it was very much like, okay, I should make this call, and just picking up the phone and then trying to get over that, 3 to 5 seconds of really sort of high anxiety to just like dial that number. Because once you hit that sort of green dial, it's like, okay, well, now it's just weird if I hang up. now I sort of have to sort of answer because they'll see that I called. So that's something, and it's something that I still feel that it's like there's this anxiety. It's much less than before, but it's still like if I've set aside certain time to do certain sort of follow-up calls or sort of cold calls, I still have that like, okay, all right, now let's do that call. And as soon as I've done the first one, the second one is easier, and the third one is easier. And then you get into a little bit of flow.
Do you have a track of how many you've done and what your conversion rate is? Is it loosely speaking?
No,
okay.
but not in general. But we kind of noticed pretty quickly, particularly sort of last year, when we hired our first salesperson and kind of saw that, yeah, like instead of doing that first email, that phone call just works so much faster because you get an answer either way so much faster. Like you don't have these sort of chains of emails saying, hey, have you seen my last email? you will have an answer, and you have an opportunity so if it doesn't work, ask the customer immediately, like, oh, okay, sort of, is it timing? Is it just that it's not interesting? And you kind of have a sort of mental sort of ease, like, all right, that's why, good, done. Versus like these email threads where we were sort of having, talking to or trying to talk to a customer for months, where it was just like, it was not going anywhere. But we also didn't have a sort of closure of like, no, this is not interesting, let's move on. So I think that process really helped us to be good at not just sort of qualifying customers, but also disqualifying, and also knowing like, okay, we've actually tried our best, and now it's time to sort of close this and move on to the next one.
Were you able to get like product feedback over the phone during those cold call sessions?
We learned a lot from those cold call sessions, and we kind of still do. And it's a lot about how do we convey value and who do we talk to. Initially, and kind of still our primary sort of point of contact is a CTO or a sort of a technical person, because it's also qualifies the customer for us. Because we're an API only tool, if they don't have the technical resources, there's no point in us talking to somebody on compliance. So we know that, okay, there's thousands of companies that have this requirement, but they might not have the volumes or sort of the technical capability to implement something where they would benefit from it. So having a sort of a qualifier, as in talking to a developer or a sort of a CTO, that answers a lot of our questions sort of immediately. But from there, we kind of generally get a lot of ideas about, okay, well, what are they thinking about? is it a sort of issue for them? If it's not, like, why not? Like, can they see something being better? So we kind of had a lot of feedback on how customers see this as a problem, because some people will see it as like a huge problem, like this is way, like we have to deal with this somehow. And other people are like, yeah, like with our volumes, with our processes, or maybe even we've automated everything. So yeah, it's fine. Like we actually don't have to do anything. And in those cases, like, well, great. When you guys are looking to renew your current supplier, we're happy to sort of, put in a bid and then sort of thank them for their time and then sort of move on from there. But I think that was also a learning that every conversation is also a learning opportunity from that perspective.
Beyond the coaching component of the accelerated program that you went to, I guess one, how'd you discover it? And two, like what'd you get out of the experience?
Yeah, I think it's one of the sort of Sweden's sort of larger and more sort of successful accelerator programs. So I've been in contact with them or in sort of exposed to them through the startup network. But for some reason, like when I started my company, I just didn't think about joining a startup accelerator. And I think thinking back, it was probably because I wasn't valuing and we weren't valuing like what an accelerator can do. Be like, oh, okay, like the coaching, yeah, we don't really need that. What happened was that like I knew about this accelerator for years. We sat with them with sort of their alumni companies while I was at one of my previous startups. And then at like an after work at a co-working space, like one friend said, hey, you should talk to this person at Sting, which is the sort of accelerator program. And then she came over, talked a little bit, and I was like, yeah, maybe we should take a look at it. And she's like, yeah, we're closing applications on Sunday, and this was on Friday. And I was like, okay. So I was like, went back, talked to sort of my co-founders. And at that point, and it seems silly now, but at that point we're like, okay, so they take an option within your sort of company, but they give you these things, and we valued them very differently then compared to how we value them now.
I see.
So at the very top, we're like, okay, so they give you 100,000 sort of Google credits. Like that's just that alone is worth everything. That's good. Let's do that. And like, oh, and you get office space. Okay, that's good. So those two things is definitely worth that like tiny percentage. That's how we kind of went into it. And then within 2 weeks, we're like, oh, those are like the least meaningful things that we can get out of this. Like, we don't even know what we would do with like 100,000 sort of Google credits because we're not scaling at that level. So we kind of really understood that, okay, it is the coaching of really understanding and getting help. And so because of their experience of helping companies go from having a proof of concept to customer and then moving on, that gave us so much. And I think I'm really glad that we took that Saturday to talk about it, and then the Saturday night to write in the application and send it in before Sunday, because honestly, like I don't think I know where we would be today if we didn't go there. We might have like wasted a lot more time, yeah, I think that was like it's still one of our sort of make it or break it moments. Like if we hadn't gone there, yeah, who knows when we would have found our first customer. And if we ever would have, it might have just been like, yeah, we'd give it a sort of a year. It didn't work out. Let's go back and do something else.
Can you dive into a specific example of what you learned from the coaching or from the courses, or something like concrete?
Mm-hmm. So I think one of the things was really understanding sort of sales. The other was really understanding, we thought that we were pretty good at segmenting our customers. We're like, oh, it's fintech companies. But really going deeper into that. And that's a journey that we've been continuing to do pretty much since we started, but really understanding like who are we building for, and sort of that kind of, even as like having worked as a product manager before, like somehow you forget everything that you did before when you start a company and you kind of start from scratch and you learn, like you forget everything you've been telling other people to do previously. So that was something very, very important for us. And also like really figuring out like what is the long-term stuff that we want to achieve, like what we're doing this right now, but how do we see the path forward? So that's really something that helped us. And I think particularly sort of the confidence to start sort of talking to customers in a different way and reach out sort of in a more proactive way. That was something that sort of really pushed us. And taking in other people's sort of input and sort of experience. I think that was from the coaching. And I think and a super practical thing was really like putting in the sort of the work. We're like, okay, we're going to have coaching sessions every other week or every week. So that coach, we told them we're going to do X amount of sort of outreaches. We have to do that now. Versus before, it was just within like amongst ourselves. So like having that discipline, and that's something that we could have kept afterwards as well. Like, all right, we have to be way more accountable to each other about what we're doing, and sort of moving that forward.
Do you feel like now that you've gone through the accelerated program, you feel more equipped to be an entrepreneur for all future businesses? Or is it specific to a specific domain?
No, I think that was like in general, something like all of these experiences that we've had with sort of coaches and accelerator is that it's not super specific, or it wasn't, at least this accelerator wasn't specific to an industry. Though they took in, like our batch had a lot of fintech and that kind of companies, which meant that we kind of built a network and we understood their sort of points. But it's something that I feel like is going to help me even in the future. I want to start more companies. Like there's lots of sort of, teething problems that I won't face in the same way, or at least know that, okay, if this happens, I've dealt with this before, I've heard about this before, I know who to ask to sort of figure out how to solve it.
I noticed on your LinkedIn, you also reference other times in your career where you were a founder, specifically for the CRA group and from some news site that you started. How do you feel like those experiences molded you to become an entrepreneur or have more experience and more preparation for your current role now? I think they did, I think they helped me figure out like what I kind of like doing. And I think from CRA group, which was like, basically it was us three students who were kind of graduating, and we kind of wanted to put our ideas or education to sort of practice. And so, okay, well, let's start something. So we kind of, even then, we started as a project, like, okay, we're going to do a project. It's going to sort of have fun and learn something while we look for work after graduation. So it was really interesting. Like we basically created a sort of book swapping site where like, you upload books that you want to sort of give away for free, and then you can sort of use those points to get books for free. And it was a great experience because, again, we kind of had to sort of learn a lot of stuff, practice all of the coding and stuff that we did in school, and then realize that, hey, we actually got 200 active users. We don't know who these people are. And like 20 of them are sending books across Sweden, to strangers, and then receiving books and sort of doing that. And we're like, oh, that's really fun. And like we didn't go anywhere else with it. Like we kind of tried with it, played with it a little bit, and then we kind of all got jobs and kind of like forgot about it. And then it's kind of funny, like recently in Sweden, like a different book sort of swapping site just got a huge investment and that's sort of growing. And we were basically 14 years too early. It's like, so, and they executed on a different level. So that was like a fun experience. But I kind of realized that I kind of liked that product idea or product work, or like that organization work. And it was the same thing with the news site. So I ran a gaming news site, and I realized that after a while, okay, more than playing the games, I liked sort of writing about them and sort of helping sort of my friends get sort of tickets to E3 so that they could go and try games, write about those games, and then I could put it up on that site and sort of organize that work. So I kind of realized that I kind of liked that part a lot more than the actual games, even though I was an avid gamer back then. Before I started entrepreneurship, I used to play a lot more video games myself. Entrepreneurship is definitely one of those heavy time commitments.
Yeah, no, for sure. I think nowadays I might fall into gaming like every now and then I get intensely into it. But that only lasts like a couple of weeks and then it disappears completely for like a year and a half. I think the last time was like Fallout 4 or something, like finished it and then nothing. Like there's no inkling of wanting to play something else.
So at the end of the year, a lot of gaming services will give you like, hey, this is what you played the past year. This is how many hours you put in. And a lot of my friends are like the couple hundred level. And like one year I had like less than 20 hours logged for the whole year. I'm like, dang, I was really busy that year. Do you have a favorite?
I think my easily go back to game is Civ 4
Okay.
or Civ 5, mainly because like I can go into it, I can sort of delve into it. It doesn't require me to coordinate with anybody else about playing together or anything like that, and I can kind of disappear into it for a while. Otherwise, like I kind of like sort of big single player RPGs because again, you can kind of disappear into them, and they don't really require again coordination with others. And it doesn't. It's like if you've done something, you can play for 5 minutes and sort of go away. But sort of the huge worlds, sort of lots of stuff to do, explore, that kind of relaxes me in a different way.
So nowadays, how do you find, or do you find work-life balance?
Yeah, I mean, that was one of the sort of important things that Adam and I discussed, like how we want work-life balance to be. And kind of, we know that like, running a company is going to take a lot of time. It's going to take a lot of sort of effort, but we also don't want to fall into, I think, what I consider to be sort of these sort of stereotypical ideas about sort of startup life, like, oh, you have to work 80 hours a week or it doesn't work. And you can't have vacation, you can't kind of do this. And we kind of want to challenge that because like I had a well-paid job at startups. Like I didn't quit my job so I could work more. Like, long term, I want to have more control and more freedom to choose what I do, and which is what I do right now. That I get to choose a lot of what I do and how I work. So I think for me, having that work-life balance is really important, and that also requires me to be really sort of thoughtful about, okay, what is the most important thing that I can be doing and should be doing. And I think I learned that, like, I think the first year because I came from like, okay, working sort of a full-time job to starting something, but we were so early that there wasn't actually stuff for me to do sort of 8 hours a day. And I was keeping busy with like, oh, I'll have to read about all of this sort of unit economics and all that kind of stuff. And then after doing that for a few months, I was like, but why? But like, we don't have any users. I don't have any sort of metrics. Like, I don't know when this will be useful. Let's focus on like what I should be doing, and like it's going to get a lot busier later. So I might as well take the sort of the free time that I can now and start sort of relaxing. Like, okay, what is the most important thing? Okay, well, it's finding customers to talk to. Like, I don't need to read about how to calculate sort of, lifetime value when I have no idea of any of that. Like, I'll learn that when I have sort of a customer and I can sort of move that forward. So that was also something that I realized that you're so used to sort of just staying busy that it sometimes you have to think about like, well, what do you actually have to do? And then how do you prioritize? I think that also becomes really important because I think especially within startups, but in work in general, you can always be doing something. You can always start a new task. And at some point you have to decide that, okay, what is the most important thing for me to do? What's going to give me the most value? And what's better that I just stop here at sort of 5 p.m. and then I'll do this thing tomorrow. Because otherwise it just becomes doing, busy work or just trying to stay busy.
What are some of the other principles that you and Adam have in common in terms of the style of business you want to build?
We discussed a lot about like building from the bottom up. We wanted to find a business model that sort of can stand on its own, and that was one of the reasons why we kind of had different criteria for like when we were deciding on different types of businesses. We're like, okay, well, we want it to be business to business. Like, that's what I have experience with. I personally have a much easier way of relating to sort of business needs and an ROI and sort of finding the underlying value for a business to a business versus something that's much more consumer friendly, because there's so many more variables there where ROI might not be a
Right.
clear, simple one. So like, well, let's definitely look at something business to business, and let's definitely look at something where we can get started and do something on our own for a while before we need to raise funding, if we ever need to raise funding. So we kind of started, and then we kind of waited 3 years before we started looking to raise funding, because we felt that, okay, we want to do it when we want to do it. We don't want to become like a stereotypical thing, like, we have an idea for a startup. Well, I guess the first step is to look for funding. Like, well, let's take a step back. Like, there's going to be opportunities to do that if we want to, and certain business will require that. Like, if you want to open a bank, you might want to do some sort of raise some funding to do that. But from our perspective, we're like, okay, what we are doing, we think actually we can get started without doing that. and we might never need it, or we might need it once we know what we need the money for. And that's kind of how we ended up doing that as well.
Do you can talk about company culture and like how you want to lead the company once you hired more people?
Yeah, we talked a lot about like how we want, again, how we want it to work. And a lot of the stuff we focused on was, transparency, openness, open communication. Something I've learned from sort of my experiences with sort of, well, friends that I really trust is that it's so much easier to sort of, it's much better to have like this 20 second of awkwardness to get a point across and say something straight up than having sort of this anxiety build or sort of a bad sort of potential situation build. So that's something that we took it with us. Is like, hey, yeah, we're going to be friendly with each other. We're going to be respectful, but we also have to be open and realize that we all want the same thing. So it's better that we talk openly with each other, knowing that we don't mean something disrespectful about each other or sort of offensive to each other, but we want the same thing, and that we should be able to talk to each other very clearly and openly. So that was a important thing, and that's something that we try to do as we're sort of hiring, sort of and growing. That okay, how do we convey that? And that's generally about how they see us communicate with each other. Like we have to be able to disagree, but we have to be able to do it in a sort of friendly, sort of respectful way. But we also have to be able to sort of question each other, and that's also how we've sort of chosen our first sort of advisors. Is that they're people that believed in us, but they weren't people who were just like, yep, everything's good, just go ahead, do whatever you do. They were questioning us, and even if it felt awkward and sort of hard, we appreciated that they could tell us that, and like once we talked to them, they appreciated that we accepted it and didn't just block them out and be like, oh, they don't understand us or something like that. It's like, no, we have to be able to hear this, and we are hearing it because they believe in us, and they also became investors, which means that like even when we have clashing discussions, we know why we're having them, and it's for the better of what we want to achieve.
How'd you find them?
It was through the network of Sting, like the accelerator. One was a coach there, and so we an expert coach that they bring in on certain sort of topics, particularly sort of sales strategy and sort of building sales teams. Another one was sort of a contact of one of our sort of regular coaches at Sting.
Okay. I have one question I want to ask before I close up, and that question is, what advice would you like to give founders or soon-to-be founders that are watching this episode?
I think I have advice on two fronts. One is from product, and one is from sales. From the product perspective, I think it's good to have an embarrassingly small product to begin with, and having that for a long time, because once you start spreading out, like and adding things, that's just going to grow as you grow. So it's going to sort of grow exponentially. So the longer you really stay niche, I think it's going to give you sort of a clarity of purpose and sort of knowing, and it's going to help you find the customers that benefit from this the most before you start looking at like, okay, well, if we add this, we can open up to other markets or sort of companies. That's always good in the future. But I think early on, I think that's probably early on might mean like the first 5 years, like stay very niche. And then sort of related to that is sales, is that, don't think that somebody else is going to do sales for you or going to do it better. They might do it better because they might, be more experienced doing sales. So they might not have the anxiety of calling people. But that's the tactical stuff. The strategic stuff, it's going to be better if you learn that to some level so that you can convey it to them, and then they can take it and do it better. But you have to be able to have an initial playbook that you can give to a new salesperson and coach them into how you sell, because what you're selling and how you're selling is as important. And you have to decide on like, what kind of culture do we have when we're selling? Is it about like, just picking up the phone, calling, if as soon as they sort of show non-interest, just hanging up? Or do you sort of really figure out who's going to sort of be your ideal customer profile, and how are you going to sort of talk to them? And if I can follow up with just one more there thing,
Sure.
is that particularly like don't go for trying to scale sales early on. Like I think that's an advice that oh, we just get emails, we just do sort of email marketing or LinkedIn marketing or something like that, and it's just going to work. I think try and do account-based marketing, like really understand like, oh, here's the type of customer that we really sort of want to have, and start doing sales calls, emails, that kind of stuff, and then start looking at how you can potentially scale that in the future. And based on, even if it might not be sort of profitable in the beginning, like even if you're doing sort of really low volume tickets or something like that, you're going to learn so much. I think that's helped us a lot.
Okay. Well, I just want to close up on one last thing. And what's the best way for our viewers to get in touch with you if they want to follow along with your journey?
I think easiest is LinkedIn. It's Siam Choudhury on LinkedIn. Also on Instagram, Siam was here. So that's me. Otherwise, they can always email me at siam@pliance.io. I enjoy talking about this stuff and sort of learning from others and sort of sharing my learnings as well. Again, one of the sort of the really cool stuff about the accelerator was that because you had companies that were kind of near each other in sort of their stage, you were always either a few months behind or a few months after somebody, or sort of in front of somebody, which meant that you could either help somebody with something that you'd just done, or you could get help from somebody who had just done something. Like, oh, they just hired their first person like 3 weeks ago. We can get like accurate, very fresh information about how they did that. Versus like, oh yeah, 5 years ago when we hired our first person, I think we did it this way. Like it doesn't become as fresh. It doesn't become as sort of interesting or sort of relevant when you're at a later stage.
Sounds good. And we'll have all the links that you just referenced in the summary of the landing page.
Oh, cool.
Well, thanks again for your time, Sian. It's been
Thanks
great.
for taking the time and talking to me.